Ethan Caldwell's battered Ford truck rattled down a narrow dirt road that wound through the frozen Montana fields, leading to what looked less like a farm and more like the bones of one. Under the pale gray sky, the house stood sagging and silent, its roof caved in on one side, its windows cracked like tired eyes staring into nothing. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, disappointment pressing heavy on his chest. But beside him, the old German shepherd named Ranger acted strangely. He did not bark or whine, only stood still in the truck bed, ears pricked, his amber eyes fixed on the collapsing barn, as if he could sense something hidden, something greater than human sight. Ethan had no idea that his dog's instinct was not warning of danger, but the first sign of a secret worth millions, a legacy buried in rust and dust that would change their lives forever. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you, amen. The sky over Helena, Montana hung low with the bruised weight of autumn clouds. The kind that promised rain but delivered instead only a thin chill that settled into the bones. The air smelled of wet leaves and rust, of soil waiting for frost, and the horizon was washed in pale light as though the sun itself had grown weary. A two-lane highway stretched through the town, cutting past shuttered diners, a single gas station, and the remnants of a once bustling mill that now sat silent, its metal husk like a monument to another era. This was the town that Ethan Caldwell was meant to call home now, though nothing about it felt like home. His truck, a dented Ford with faded Marine Corps bumper stickers clinging stubbornly to the rear, coughed its way down Main Street. Behind the wheel sat Ethan, 36 years old, his broad shoulders filling the cab, his posture slouched in a way that suggested both exhaustion and a cautious readiness, as though he had never truly left the battlefield. His hair, once a rich brown, was peppered with strands of premature gray that framed a square jawline etched by years of sand, sweat, and sleepless nights. His hazel eyes, sharp yet shadowed, carried the weight of deserts half a world away, where convoys rolled under hostile skies and memories refused to fade. Ethan was not the kind of man who spoke often, but when he did, his voice carried the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen what silence could cost. Ethan's life since leaving the Marines had been a patchwork of odd jobs and hospital waiting rooms, a tug-of-war between mounting debt and the ever-present need to shield his daughter from the darker edges of his world. His wife had left years earlier. Some said she couldn't live with the man war had returned to her. Others whispered she had simply grown tired of the hollow nights and haunted mornings. Ethan never corrected them. The truth was simpler and harder. She was gone, and Emma, their daughter, was his only anchor to a life worth saving. Emma Caldwell was 8 years old, small for her age but wiry, with the restless energy of a child who had grown up learning to entertain herself. She had long, golden-brown hair that curled stubbornly at the ends and eyes the color of new leaves in spring, wide and endlessly curious. Her freckles dusted across a nose that wrinkled whenever she smiled, which was often, though those smiles were tinged with a depth that children her age rarely carried. Emma had inherited her father's stubbornness, a chin that lifted just slightly when she was determined, and her mother's gift for finding brightness even in ruin. She carried a worn stuffed rabbit in her backpack, the ears nearly threadbare, and whenever Ethan caught her clutching it, he was reminded of how small she still was in a world that demanded so much. In the bed of the truck sat Ranger, a retired military German shepherd, now 7 years old but still commanding in his bearing. His coat was a rugged blend of sable black and tan, peppered with streaks of gray near the muzzle, and one ear bore the jagged tear of an old injury. His amber eyes were alive with intelligence, every movement measured and alert, his muscles rippling even in stillness. Ranger had served alongside Ethan during his final deployment, a K-9 whose loyalty had saved lives more than once. Now he was more than just a dog, he was Ethan's partner, Emma's guardian, and perhaps the only creature that understood the silent battles still raging inside Ethan's mind. He walked with a slight limp from shrapnel that had grazed him years before, but he carried it with the dignity of a veteran who had nothing left to prove. As Ethan's truck slowed near the courthouse square, whispers followed him. A few men leaned against the wall outside the hardware store, their laughter carrying in the crisp air. "There goes the hero," one of them muttered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. "Came back from war to inherit a junkyard." Another spat on the sidewalk, shaking his head. "Guess even soldiers end up with trash when the world's done with them." Ethan didn't respond. He had learned long ago that words were arrows you didn't need to catch. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenched, while Emma leaned forward from the back seat, her small voice cutting through the murmur of ridicule. "Daddy, don't listen," she said softly, and Ranger's low growl from the truck bed seemed to echo her sentiment. The inheritance in question was a 20-acre tract of land on the outskirts of town, once belonging to Ethan's estranged uncle, a man he had met only twice in his life. The man had died quietly in a hospital room, leaving behind no family except Ethan and the ramshackle farm he had refused to sell despite years of decline. Now, locals scoffed at the idea that the former Marine would manage anything more than weeds and rust. To them, it was a cruel joke. To Ethan, it was both a curse and a final chance, perhaps his only chance to build something stable for Emma. The truck rattled out of town, following a winding road fringed with skeletal trees until the land opened wide and barren. The farm emerged from the mist like a relic from another age. Fences sagged where cattle once stood, and the barn leaned precariously as though one strong wind might fold it in half. The farmhouse itself was no better, peeling paint, broken windows, and a roof that had collapsed in one corner. Old machinery lay scattered across the field's tractors, without wheels, rusted plows, and twisted piles of metal that glistened dully under the gray sky. It was less a farm and more a graveyard of forgotten work. Ethan parked, killing the engine, and for a moment the silence pressed in around them, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken shutters. Emma stared at the house, her eyes wide. "Is this ours?" she asked. Her voice carried a note of wonder rather than disappointment, the way children sometimes saw possibility where adults saw only ruin. Ethan nodded, though his throat felt tight. "It's home," he said, the word tasting unfamiliar. Ranger leapt down from the truck bed, nose to the ground, circling the perimeter with the practiced caution of a soldier on patrol. His tail was stiff, ears flicking as he sniffed the air, then paused near the barn, his gaze fixed with a tension that Ethan recognized instantly. Ranger sensed something beyond the ordinary scent of rot and dust. In town, while Ethan confronted the reality of his inheritance, another story was beginning. Caroline Moore sat in her cramped office above the Helena Gazette, her desk littered with stacks of property deeds, maps, and legal notices. Caroline was 29, with auburn hair that tumbled loosely to her shoulders and sharp green eyes framed by dark-rimmed glasses. She had the look of someone who spent too much time in fluorescent-lit rooms but still carried a spark of restless energy, a journalist with ink-stained fingers and a relentless curiosity. She was not tall, slender, and wiry, with the habit of perching on the edge of her chair rather than sitting back, as though ready to spring into action at any moment. Caroline's reputation was complicated. To some, she was nosy, prying into matters best left alone. To others, she was one of the last truth-seekers in a town where silence often carried a price. Her latest investigation had drawn her into the murky waters of land acquisition. Developers with deep pockets were buying up rural properties across Montana, sometimes through legal pressure, other times through intimidation. Caroline had begun to notice a pattern shell companies with connections to larger corporations, properties switching hands at suspiciously low prices, and families who quietly vanished after selling. When she heard that a Marine veteran had inherited one of the last unsold tracts on the outskirts, her instincts sharpened. She made a note in her journal. Caldwell Farm. Worth watching. Back at the farm, Ethan pushed open the creaking door of the farmhouse, the smell of mildew and neglect washing over him. Emma clutched his hand tightly, her stuffed rabbit peeking out from her backpack. The floors groaned under their steps, dust rising in lazy spirals where sunlight cut through broken panes. In the corner of the living room, a family photograph still hung on the wall, faded beyond recognition. Ethan stared at it, feeling the weight of generations pressing down. This house was more than a ruin. It was a reminder of roots he barely knew and responsibilities he had never wanted but could not ignore. "Daddy?" Emma's voice pulled him back. She looked up at him with wide, searching eyes. "Can we fix it?" Ethan crouched to her level, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He wanted to tell her yes, wanted to believe it himself. "We'll try," he said finally. Ranger padded into the room, tail low but steady, and sat beside them, his amber gaze fixed on Ethan as if to remind him he was not alone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters like distant gunfire. Ethan felt the echo of old battles stirring inside. The ghosts of commands shouted over the roar of engines, the acrid taste of sand in his throat. But here, in this broken farmhouse with his daughter's hand in his and his dog at his side, he found something he had not felt in years, a fragile thread of purpose. The farm was mocked by others as worthless, a junkyard in all but name. Yet for Ethan, it was the ground on which he would stand or fall. His goal was simple and vast at once, to carve out a life where Emma could grow without fear, to build stability from decay, and to silence the voices that doubted him, not with words, but with proof. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed that Ranger's unease was more than instinct, that this farm held secrets long buried. For now, though, all he had was the skeletal frame of a house, a little girl who believed in him, and a dog whose loyalty was unshakable. It would have to be enough. The Montana morning arrived, shrouded in a dim light, the clouds thick and sluggish over the valley, smothering the sun as if determined to deny the land its warmth. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass that sprawled unevenly around the Caldwell farm, and the air smelled of damp earth and old iron. A cold wind swept across the prairie, rattling the sagging fence posts and carrying the hollow clang of loose tin sheets on the barn. For Ethan Caldwell, standing on the creaking porch of his uncle's farmhouse, it felt less like the dawn of a new life, and more like a sentence handed down from fate. The farmhouse groaned under its own weight. The roof sloped dangerously on one side, where shingles had been stripped bare by years of neglect. Windows were cracked, patched with tape and cardboard. The paint had peeled so badly that the wood beneath was swollen and splintering, gray with rot. Inside, the floors bowed underfoot, sagging like tired lungs. Ethan took it all in with a steady but weary gaze, his large hands resting on his hips as Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit and peered up at him, her breath forming small clouds in the chilled air. "Daddy," she whispered, "it looks sad." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hazel eyes flicking from the roof line to the barn beyond. "Then we'll make it less sad," he answered, though the words felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Ranger, the German shepherd, padded across the yard, sniffing intently. His dark coat shimmered with flecks of gray, and his amber eyes burned with concentration. He stalked the perimeter as though on patrol, ears swiveling at every sound. When he reached the old workshop that leaned behind the barn, he froze, muscles taut, tail stiffened. His nose pressed against the weather-beaten boards, and a low growl escaped his throat. Ethan noticed, frowning, but forced himself to look away. Too many battles lay ahead for him to indulge the suspicion of a dog, no matter how loyal. Still, Ranger lingered there, returning again and again to sniff the same place, his instincts gnawing at something hidden. By midday, the first visitor arrived. A rusted Chevy pickup pulled up the gravel drive, and from it stepped Marlene Hawkins, the nearest neighbor. Marlene was in her early 60s, her frame stout and round from years of hearty farm meals, with gray-streaked hair tucked beneath a wool cap. Her cheeks were ruddy from the cold, and her small eyes carried the perpetual squint of someone accustomed to glaring into the wind. Marlene had lived in Helena all her life, a widow who raised 3 boys on her own after her husband died in a sawmill accident. She was quick to speak her mind and even quicker to laugh at others' expense. "Well, I'll be," Marlene said, her voice carrying the nasal twang of the high plains. "The war heroes come home to a pile of junk." Her eyes flicked over the tractor carcasses and rusted plows littering the field. "They didn't tell you it was a scrapyard, did they?" She let out a laugh that was half amusement, half cruelty. Ethan simply nodded, unwilling to bite. Emma shrank closer to his side, clutching his sleeve. Marlene caught the gesture and her grin faltered briefly, but she recovered, shaking her head. "Well, good luck with it. You'll need it." She climbed back into her truck, the engine coughing as she pulled away, dust curling up behind her tires. Ethan exhaled, his hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder. He had expected mockery. Marines were trained to withstand worse than words, but hearing them aimed at Emma was different. His goal remained steady in his chest, to build a safe place for her, no matter how broken the house, no matter how cruel the neighbors. That evening, Ethan worked in silence. He hauled boxes from the truck, stacking their meager belongings inside the living room where the only warmth came from a portable propane heater. Emma spread her blanket across the sagging sofa, curling up beside Ranger, who rested with his head on her lap. his eyes half-lidded, but never fully at ease. Ethan patched a hole in the roof with plywood, his breath puffing in the cold, his muscles aching with each swing of the hammer. The farmhouse might have been mocked as worthless, but each nail he drove felt like an act of defiance, a declaration that he was not finished yet. Meanwhile, across town, Caroline Moore sifted through another stack of property records in her cramped office above the Gazette. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping to frame her pale face. The green of her eyes was sharpened by exhaustion, but she pressed on. The stack of deeds on her desk told a story that no one else seemed to care about. Her investigation had begun innocuously enough. A retired couple who had sold their farm at a fraction of its value, another family pressured into foreclosure after missing payments. But as Caroline connected the dots, she noticed something chilling. The same holding company name appeared on nearly every record: Silverthorne Development Group. On paper, it looked like a legitimate firm, but Caroline's instincts told her otherwise. Each acquisition was tied to legal intimidation, sudden inspections, or anonymous complaints that forced families to sell. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, her mind turning over the names. At the center of it all, one man's name surfaced repeatedly: Victor Harlan. A local businessman in his late 50s, Victor had risen from a small-time contractor to the head of a multi-million-dollar development empire. He was tall and lean, with silver hair slicked back and steel-blue eyes that conveyed both charm and menace. His reputation was that of a man who never took no for an answer, who saw land not as heritage or livelihood but as currency to be bent to his will. Caroline had never met him in person, but the whispers she heard from townsfolk painted him as ruthless, a man who could smile at you while cutting away everything you owned. Caroline circled his name in her notes. If Victor was connected to the Caldwell farm, then Ethan, this Marine who had inherited a scrapyard, might have stumbled into something much larger than a ruined inheritance. She resolved to keep watch. Back on the farm, night pressed down. The wind carried the sound of coyotes yipping in the distance, and the farmhouse walls groaned as though resenting the new occupants. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, her rabbit clutched tight. Ranger curled protectively beside her. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering flame of a lantern. His hands were calloused, his knuckles scarred, reminders of battles both physical and unseen. He rubbed his temples, fighting back the pounding ache of memories that slipped in unbidden convoys crawling through desert heat, the crack of gunfire, the smell of burning rubber and dust. PTSD was a battle he had never chosen, but could not walk away from. Ranger stirred suddenly, ears pricked. He padded toward the back door, nose twitching, a low growl reverberating in his chest. Ethan followed, flashlight in hand. Together they stepped into the cold night, their breath visible in the beam of the light. Ranger led him toward the barn, stopping near the warped planks of the old workshop. The dog's nose pressed against the wood, claws scratching at the ground. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured. He shined the flashlight across the boards, revealing nothing but rot and dust. Still, Ranger stood stiff, his body rigid, his amber eyes locked on something unseen. Ethan crouched, running a hand along the wood. Nothing. He gave Ranger's flank a firm pat. "Not tonight." The dog whined, reluctantly retreating, though his eyes lingered on the workshop as if unwilling to abandon the secret it held. Inside again, Ethan stood over his sleeping daughter. The house was broken, mocked by neighbors, but within its walls he saw the faint glimmer of possibility. He had fought wars across the world. Now he would fight here, for Emma, for himself, and maybe for something larger he did not yet understand. Outside, Ranger lay by the door, his head resting on his paws, his ears alert, watching the darkness as though it might one day give up its secrets. The next morning broke gray and sullen over the valley, the frost still clinging to the broken shingles of the farmhouse roof. The air had the sharp edge of winter in it, though the calendar still swore autumn, and the wind cut through the bare trees with a whistling that sounded almost like voices. Ethan Caldwell rose early, his back stiff from a night spent on the floor beside the propane heater. Emma was still asleep on the couch, Ranger stretched out protectively at her feet. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to watch her dream, her tiny chest rising and falling, a stuffed rabbit hugged close. It was for her that he was here, for her that he endured the mocking stares and hollow laughter of a town that saw him as a failure. She was his compass, his purpose. The sound of tires crunching gravel pulled him from thought. Ethan stepped onto the porch, shoulders squared, as a sleek black Cadillac rolled into the yard, out of place against the rusting skeletons of tractors and plows. The door opened, and out stepped Victor Harlan. Victor was in his late 50s, tall and lean with the wiry posture of a man who still jogged every morning to prove he could. His silver hair was slicked neatly back, his steel blue eyes cold but framed by practiced crow's feet that suggested charm when it suited him. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat that hugged his frame, polished black shoes that gleamed even in the mud, and a silk tie that looked more Wall Street than Montana dirt. Victor carried himself with the air of someone who owned not only the ground he stood on, but the air others breathed. "Mr. Caldwell," Victor said smoothly, his voice like polished granite, "quite the residence you've inherited." His eyes scanned the sagging house and rusted fields with a faint smirk. "Looks more like a junkyard than a farm. I imagine it's quite a burden." Ethan crossed his arms, saying nothing at first. Silence was often more effective than words. Victor slipped his hands into his coat pockets, tilting his head. "I'm here to make you an offer. 200,000 cash, more than fair for this heap of rot. You take it, move Emma somewhere civilized, somewhere stable. You'll be rid of all this nonsense." His gaze flicked toward the window where Emma's face now peeked nervously from behind the glass. Victor's smile widened faintly, calculated. "She deserves better than a drafty shack and a father playing farmer." The words were daggers. Ethan's hazel eyes narrowed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even. "She has better. She has me." Victor's smirk thinned into something sharper. For now. The implication hung in the cold air, heavy as an axe. Then, as quickly as he had come, Victor offered a final card. His pristine business card pressed between two fingers, the embossed Silverthorne Development logo glinting in the pale light. "Think it over, Marine. Pride doesn't keep the lights on." He returned to his car, leaving Ethan standing rigid on the porch as the Cadillac disappeared in a swirl of gravel dust. Inside, Ethan slid the card into the drawer of the rickety kitchen table. His hand trembled faintly, though his jaw remained set. He had faced men with guns, men who would kill without hesitation. Yet there was something about Victor's casual authority, his veiled threats wrapped in silk, that wormed its way under Ethan's skin. This was not a battlefield he understood, but it was one he would have to fight. That night the storm came. Rain hammered against the broken windows, wind howling through cracks in the farmhouse like the cries of ghosts. The old barn groaned, its roof rattling as though it might collapse under the weight of the storm. Ethan sat awake, rifle propped against the wall, while Ranger paced restlessly. The dog's instincts were keener than any human's, and tonight they were screaming. Near midnight, Ranger stopped pacing and planted himself by the workshop wall, nose pressed to the boards. His growl was deep and insistent, claws scraping against the rotten wood. Ethan rose, flashlight in hand, and crossed the yard in the downpour. "What is it, boy?" The beam of light flickered across the warped planks, and as Ethan drew closer, he saw what Ranger had uncovered. A faint seam ran along the wall, almost invisible under the grime. Ranger dug furiously now, the sound of claws ripping against wood drowned only by the pounding rain. Ethan dropped to his knees, pried at the seam, and with a splintering crack the false panel gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a rusted iron chest, small but heavy. Ethan dragged it into the workshop, his heart thudding as though he'd stumbled into a minefield. The lock was brittle with age, snapping easily beneath the weight of his hammer. When the lid creaked open, the smell of oil and time washed over him. Inside lay leather-bound journals, brittle pages filled with meticulous handwriting and stacks of intricate sketches. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of blueprints so precise they seemed to hum with possibility. Ethan turned a page, his breath catching. The signature at the bottom of the entries read, Thomas Caldwell. His uncle. He had been more than a recluse farmer. He had been an aerospace engineer. The notes described aerodynamic theories Ethan barely comprehended, and diagrams of machinery that looked decades ahead of its time. One sketch showed a design for an aircraft powered by advanced propulsion, capable of stability in storms that would ground conventional planes. Ethan sat back, water dripping from his coat. The storm raging outside. His uncle had hidden something extraordinary. Ranger sat beside him, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the open chest as though sensing the gravity of the discovery. While Ethan turned over the mystery of his uncle's legacy, in town, Caroline Moore was piecing together a puzzle of her own. The Gazette office was nearly empty, the only sound the scratch of her pen and the hum of an old radiator. Caroline flipped through another file, her auburn hair falling into her face as her sharp green eyes narrowed. The name Victor Harlan appeared again and again, attached to lawsuits, foreclosures, acquisitions that ended in ruin for families. She traced one case to a rancher who had resisted until Victor buried him under legal fees, forcing him into bankruptcy. Another to a widow whose land was stripped after anonymous building code complaints crippled her finances. Each story told the same tale. Harlan destroyed lives to claim their land. Caroline leaned back, chewing the end of her pen. The Caldwell farm was next. She could feel it. She wrote Ethan's name in her notebook and circled it twice. He was not just an unlucky Marine with a ruined inheritance. He was standing in the path of a man who devoured everything in his way. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan sat in the dim glow of the lantern, journals spread before him. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, while Ranger dozed at the doorway, though his ears twitched at every creak of the storm. Ethan's hands rested on the sketches, his mind racing. He had fought wars where survival was the only goal. Now, perhaps, he held in his hands something worth more than land, more than money, something his uncle had fought to keep hidden. But with Victor Harlan circling like a vulture, Ethan knew the discovery was both a gift and a danger. He closed the chest, locking the secrets back inside, at least for now. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes meeting Ethan's, as though silently promising he would guard what they had found. The storm raged on, but inside Ethan felt something shift. The threat had been spoken, the battle lines were drawn, and in the hidden chest of a ruined workshop, the first piece of a forgotten legacy had emerged. The storm had passed, leaving the Montana morning washed in a brittle clarity. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar, the sky a pale, washed-out blue streaked with lingering clouds. The farm looked almost beautiful beneath that light, though the house sagged and the barn leaned, its wounds exposed in sharper detail. Ethan Caldwell sat at the kitchen table, the journals and sketches of his late uncle spread across the scarred wood, pages curling at the corners from years of neglect. His fingers, thick and scarred from service, moved carefully over the drawings as if they were weapons too delicate to mishandle. The designs were extraordinary, not just diagrams of aircraft, but something deeper, an energy system, unlike anything Ethan had seen in his years of practical machinery. It was a solar array, compact and revolutionary, sketched decades before the world had clamored for renewable solutions. The mechanism appeared to capture and store energy at a level far beyond its time, a technology that, if realized, could power entire communities. Ethan wasn't an engineer, but he knew value when he saw it. This wasn't just scrap paper. It was a fortune disguised as a forgotten legacy. Emma shuffled into the room, her hair a golden brown tangle, her small hands rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Morning, Daddy," she mumbled, before climbing onto a chair. She peered at the papers, her young brow furrowed. "Did Uncle Thomas draw all this?" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. His voice carried a weight Emma was too young to understand. He smoothed a hand over the sketch of a sleek solar panel system. "He left us something important." Before Emma could ask more, Ranger barked sharply from the porch, the deep timbre reverberating through the walls. Ethan rose quickly, instincts still wired from years in combat. Through the window he saw a county sedan pulling into the drive, its paint chipped, but its presence foreboding. Out stepped Margaret Albright, a social worker from the Department of Human Services. Margaret was in her early 40s, tall and spare, her angular frame wrapped in a long wool coat. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, not a strand out of place, and her pale face carried the pinched look of someone accustomed to judgment. Her brown eyes were observant but weary, as if she'd seen too many homes fall short of safety, too many children caught in the crossfire of broken lives. She carried a clipboard tucked beneath her arm and a leather satchel at her side. "Mr. Caldwell?" she called, her tone polite but cool. "I'm with Child Protective Services. May I come in?" Ethan stiffened, his mind racing. He opened the door only halfway, his broad frame filling the gap. "What's this about?" Margaret adjusted her glasses, her voice measured. "We received a report expressing concern for Emma's welfare. I'm required to investigate conditions here to ensure she's safe." Behind Ethan, Emma peeked out nervously, clutching her rabbit. Ranger stood firm, his amber eyes locked on the stranger, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Ethan felt his pulse hammer. He knew exactly who had orchestrated this. Victor Harlan's threat had not been idle. Now it came dressed in official authority with the power to tear his world apart. "Come in," Ethan said tightly. He stepped aside, his hand instinctively brushing Emma's shoulder as she shrank behind him. Margaret entered, her eyes scanning everything, the patched roof visible through a window, the worn floorboards, the propane heater flickering in the corner. She took notes methodically, her pen scratching with a sound that felt louder than the storm last night. "How long have you been living here?" "A week," Ethan replied. "Do you have running water?" "Working on it," he said, jaw tight. She frowned, making another note. Emma stepped forward then, her small voice trembling but steady. "My daddy takes care of me. He makes pancakes when the stove works, and Ranger keeps me safe." Margaret's eyes softened briefly at the sight of the little girl clutching her stuffed rabbit, but professionalism quickly returned. "I'll need to schedule a follow-up," she said, closing her folder. "Mr. Caldwell, I must stress the importance of providing stable, safe conditions for your daughter. Until then—" Her pause was deliberate. "Her custody status may be subject to review." The words hit Ethan like shrapnel. His worst fear was not dying, not poverty, but losing Emma. The thought of her taken away, placed in some sterile foster system, was unbearable. He nodded curtly, forcing calm, though inside rage and dread twisted like barbed wire. When Margaret finally left, Ranger followed her to the car, growling until she drove off. Ethan sank onto the porch steps, burying his face in his hands. Emma slipped beside him, leaning her small frame against his broad shoulder. "You won't let them take me, will you?" she whispered. "Never," Ethan said. His voice broke, just slightly. He wrapped an arm around her, holding on as though the world itself was trying to pry her away. Elsewhere, in her office above the Gazette, Caroline Moore sat hunched over her typewriter, surrounded by stacks of files. The air smelled of stale coffee and ink. Her sharp green eyes flicked across the page as she typed notes into a draft that would never see print, at least not yet. Caroline had uncovered case after case where Victor Harlan's empire devoured families whole. Lawsuits, zoning violations, mysterious anonymous tips that summoned inspectors until the pressure broke people into selling. Each story carried the same pattern, and now with Ethan Caldwell on her radar, Caroline saw the same claws reaching again. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her notebook. She remembered her father, a carpenter who had lost his land to a crooked developer when she was just a teenager. That injustice had burned itself into her, shaping her into the journalist she became. To her, Ethan wasn't just another man struggling to hold on to a farm. He was the crack in Victor's carefully built facade, the chance to expose him. Caroline made a decision. She closed the file on her desk and pulled on her coat, auburn strands falling loose from her bun. She would go to the Caldwell farm, not as a reporter seeking a story, but as an ally offering help. She knew it was risky. Victor Harlan's reach was long, and crossing him often ended careers, but she couldn't stand by while another family was crushed. As dusk settled on the valley, the farmhouse glowed faintly with lantern light. Ethan patched leaks in the roof with salvaged tarps while Emma read by flashlight, Ranger curled at her feet. The journals of Thomas Caldwell sat hidden again, locked in the chest beneath the floorboards of the workshop. Ethan had decided to protect them, though he didn't yet know how. Caroline's car pulled into the drive, her headlights sweeping across the field of rusted machinery. Ethan emerged from the porch, wary, his broad shoulders backlit against the fading light. "Mr. Caldwell?" Caroline called, stepping from her car. She was smaller than he expected, wiry but confident, her green eyes sharp even in the dim. She held out a hand. "Caroline Moore, I'm a journalist, but right now I'm not here for a story. I'm here because I believe I can help you." Ethan studied her, suspicion hard in his gaze. "Why?" Caroline took a breath. "Because I know Victor Harlan. I've seen what he does, and I think what's happening to you could be the key to stopping him." For a long moment, only the wind answered, whistling through the broken slats of the barn. Then Ranger padded forward, nose twitching, circling Caroline once before settling at Ethan's side. Ethan's eyes flicked down to his dog, then back to Caroline, Finally, he gave a short nod. "Come inside." As the door closed behind them, the farmhouse seemed a little less broken. Somewhere within those fragile walls, alliances were beginning to form. Ethan's greatest fear remained, the loss of Emma. But now, he was no longer entirely alone. The first hints of winter had arrived in Helena. The fields that once stretched golden were now brittle and brown, stripped bare by the wind. The Caldwell farmhouse stood beneath a pale sky, the roof patched with tarps, its broken windows sealed in plastic. Yet inside, something had shifted. Where despair once hung, there was now the rhythm of determination, the faint sound of typewriter keys, the scratch of pens, and the low murmur of voices planning for war. Caroline Moore sat at the kitchen table, auburn strands of hair falling into her eyes as she pored over a pile of papers. Across from her, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his expression calm but tight, like a man preparing for a fight he did not fully understand. Emma played quietly in the corner with Ranger, the dog lying stretched out beside her, watchful as ever. Caroline closed the folder and looked at Ethan. "You need a lawyer," she said firmly. "Not just any lawyer. Someone who isn't afraid to stare Victor Harlan in the eye and not blink." "I can't afford one," Ethan replied flatly. "That's why you need Daniel Cross," Caroline said. That afternoon, Caroline drove Ethan into town to meet Daniel. The small law office sat between a bakery and a barber shop on Main Street. The door was glass, painted with the words Cross and Kincaid, attorneys at law. Inside, the space smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish. Daniel Cross emerged from the back office, a man in his early 30s with a lean, athletic build. His dark blonde hair was tousled as though he'd run his hands through it one too many times, and his square jaw was softened by a faint stubble. His hazel eyes were sharp but warm, the kind of eyes that suggested both intelligence and empathy. He wore a navy suit that fit him well but had a looseness about the tie that revealed long hours and little patience for appearances. "Ethan Caldwell," Daniel said, offering his hand with a firm grip. "Caroline's told me a little about your situation. Have a seat." As Ethan sat, Daniel pulled out a legal pad. "Here's how I work. No upfront fees. I take contingency cases. If we win, I get paid. If we lose, you owe nothing. It keeps things simple." "Why take the risk?" Ethan asked. Daniel smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his tired eyes. "Because I hate bullies, and Victor Harlan's been one for a long time." They talked for hours. Ethan laid out what he had found. The journals, the blueprints. Caroline added the web of acquisitions she had uncovered. Daniel scribbled notes rapidly, tapping the pen against the pad when deep in thought. Finally, he leaned back. "This isn't just property. This is intellectual theft. If your uncle was defrauded by Victor years ago and you've got evidence, then we've got leverage. But be prepared. Harlan doesn't lose without a fight. He'll bury you in paperwork before he lets this see a courtroom." He wasn't exaggerating. Within days, thick envelopes began arriving at the farmhouse motions, demands for depositions, pages of accusations meant to overwhelm. Victor's lawyers worked like a machine, their signatures scrawled in ink across documents that piled higher than Emma's schoolbooks. Ethan sat at the kitchen table night after night, sifting through them, his brow furrowed, while Ranger dozed at his feet. Daniel reassured him. "It's intimidation, nothing more. Let me handle it." But the pressure was real. Inspectors came to the farm unannounced, citing code violations. Anonymous calls sent county officers to check on livestock Ethan didn't even own. The electric company threatened shutoff over a bill Ethan had already paid. Each day felt like a new assault, orchestrated by Victor's hand. One night, after a long day of digging trenches to redirect water from the barn, Ethan sat on the porch staring into the distance. Ranger paced the yard, nose to the ground, his tail stiff with concentration. Suddenly he stopped at the great oak tree that stood at the edge of the property, its branches bare against the twilight. He began to dig furiously at the roots, dirt spraying behind him. "Ranger!" Ethan called, but the dog ignored him, paws tearing into the soil with a determination Ethan had learned never to doubt. Finally, Ranger's claws struck something hard with a dull metallic clang. Ethan knelt beside him, brushing away dirt until his hands closed around a small rusted box sealed with a padlock corroded nearly to dust. Inside, beneath layers of moldy fabric, was a letter. The handwriting was the same neat script Ethan had seen in Thomas Caldwell's journals. His uncle's words spilled across the page, each line weighted with desperation. "If you are reading this, then I have failed." Victor Harlan came to me with promises of partnership, but what he wanted was my life's work. He twisted contracts, threatened ruin, and I was too proud to fight. "I fear he will destroy everything I built. I hide this here, in hope that one day someone stronger will finish the fight I could not. My invention was never meant for profit, only for service. Protect it, use it for good, and never trust Harlan." At the bottom was Thomas's trembling signature. It was more than a letter. It was proof of Victor's deception, of theft and betrayal buried for decades. Ethan folded it carefully, his hands shaking as Ranger sat beside him, amber eyes watchful. When Ethan handed the letter to Daniel the next morning, the lawyer's face hardened. He read it twice, then looked up, eyes blazing. "This changes everything. This isn't just a case, it's a reckoning." Caroline, seated at the edge of the desk, leaned forward. "It's the crack we need. Once the court sees this, Harlan won't be able to bury the truth." Ethan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the letter. He thought of Emma sleeping safely in the farmhouse, of Margaret Albright's warning that custody could be stripped away, of Victor's smirk as he promised she deserved better. For the first time he felt hope stir, fragile but fierce. His uncle's words were no longer just a confession. They were a torch passed down, one Ethan would carry into the battle ahead. The storm Victor had unleashed was still gathering, but Ethan now held a weapon that could pierce it. And with Caroline and Daniel by his side, and Ranger at his feet, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. The courthouse in Helena stood on Main Street like an old sentinel, its brick facade weathered by decades of wind and snow, its arched windows glowing faintly in the pale winter sun. On the morning of the trial, the square outside was alive with whispers. Reporters clustered near the steps, cameras poised, their breath clouding in the sharp cold. For most, it was just another case, another wealthy developer accused of cutting corners. But for Ethan Caldwell, walking up those stone steps with his daughter's small hand in his, it was everything. Ethan wore the only suit he owned, dark and slightly ill-fitting, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric. His hazel eyes were steady but shadowed, his jaw set with the quiet resolve of a Marine who had faced worse and survived. Emma walked beside him, her golden brown hair braided neatly by Caroline that morning, a red ribbon tied at the end. She carried her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm like a talisman. At their side padded Ranger, the German shepherd, his coat gleaming despite the gray muzzle, amber eyes sharp. Officially, dogs weren't permitted inside, but the judge had granted an exception after Daniel Cross argued Ranger was part of Ethan's recovery from combat trauma. The animal walked proudly, as though he too understood the importance of this day. Inside, the courtroom smelled of varnished oak and dust. The benches were crowded with locals, curious to see the downfall of a man many feared but few dared to challenge. At the defense table sat Victor Harlan, tall and lean in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly in place, his steel blue eyes cold and contemptuous. Around him, 8 attorneys in immaculate suits flipped through binders whispering strategy. Victor sat with the casual arrogance of someone who had always won. Across the aisle, Ethan sat flanked by Daniel Cross and Caroline Moore. Daniel, his suit wrinkled at the elbows from long nights of work, exuded calm intensity. His hazel eyes were alight with fire as he organized the evidence. Thomas Caldwell's journals, the blueprints, the rusted metal box, and the letter that had changed everything. Caroline sat a few rows back, her green eyes sharp behind dark-rimmed glasses, a notebook open in her lap. She had become more than a journalist now. She was a witness to truth, ready to shine light where shadows had long ruled. At the bench presided Judge Eleanor Peterson, a woman in her 60s with cropped gray hair and piercing blue eyes. Tall and spare, she wore her black robes with quiet dignity. Known throughout Montana as meticulous and incorruptible, she was respected even by those who feared her rulings. Years earlier, she had been a public defender for battered women, and though her face carried the lines of age, her gaze held the weight of someone who had seen both cruelty and courage. The trial unfolded like a storm. Victor's lawyers presented motion after motion, painting Ethan as an unfit father, a desperate man clinging to fantasies. They waved photographs of the broken farmhouse, cited the visit from Margaret Albright, and claimed Ethan had endangered Emma. Their voices dripped with condescension. Daniel Cross countered with precision. He spoke not with bluster, but with conviction, laying out the evidence piece by piece. He presented the blueprints, explaining through expert witnesses how Thomas Caldwell's designs were decades ahead of their time. He read aloud from Thomas's journals, his voice firm as the words filled the courtroom. "I hide this here, in hope that one day someone stronger will finish the fight I could not." And finally, he revealed the letter Ranger had led Ethan to, the trembling confession of betrayal, naming Victor Harlan directly. The courtroom fell silent as the words were read. Victor shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but his lawyers pressed on, attacking the letter's authenticity. Yet the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Emma was called briefly to the stand, a terrifying prospect for an 8-year-old. She sat small in the witness chair, feet not touching the floor, her stuffed rabbit clutched in her lap. Her voice trembled at first, but when Daniel asked, "Does your father take care of you?" she looked across the room at Ethan and said clearly, "Yes, he's my home." The simple truth struck harder than any argument. Ranger, though he could not testify, had his presence felt nonetheless. His discovery of the letter had been documented and presented, and the sight of the aging shepherd lying calmly beside Ethan through every blow of the trial was a silent reminder of loyalty and truth. By the third day, it was clear the tide had turned. Victor's empire, built on intimidation and fraud, was exposed. Caroline's articles, already drafted, would spread the story far beyond Helena, but here in the courtroom the battle was nearly won. Finally, Judge Peterson delivered her verdict. Her voice was steady, cutting through the hushed room. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff Ethan Caldwell. All patents, designs, and intellectual property of Thomas Caldwell's solar energy system are hereby recognized as the legal inheritance of Ethan Caldwell. Furthermore, custody of Emma Caldwell is affirmed and secured. This court finds no grounds for removal of parental rights." She looked directly at Victor, her gaze unflinching. "Mr. Harlan, your conduct has been profoundly unethical. Consider this a warning. Your influence does not place you above the law." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Ethan felt Emma's small hand slide into his, her eyes bright with relief. Daniel exhaled slowly, a smile ghosting across his tired face. Caroline scribbled furiously, her heart pounding. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, flooding the courthouse steps in golden light. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as Caroline's first article hit the presses within hours. The headline blazed, "Developer's Empire Exposed, Marine Veteran Wins Landmark Case." The story spread beyond Montana, carried by national outlets hungry for a tale of justice. Caroline had not only exposed Victor Harlan, but rekindled a conversation about corruption, land, and power. Weeks later, the Caldwell farm no longer looked like a ruin. Fresh paint covered the old house, the roof was mended, and the barn stood steady once more. Solar panels, Thomas's dream now made real, gleamed in the winter sun, installed through the new Caldwell Foundation for Clean Energy, a nonprofit Ethan had established with Daniel and Caroline's help. The technology would not be sold to the highest bidder, but used for community power, for search and rescue teams, for rural families long forgotten. It was Thomas's legacy, reborn. On a late afternoon, as the sky burned orange over the Montana plains, Ethan stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching Emma race through the grass with Ranger at her heels. The shepherd's gait was slower now, his limp more pronounced, but his amber eyes shone with the same fierce devotion. Emma laughed, her red ribbon trailing behind her, the sound carrying across the field. Ethan breathed deeply, the cold air filling his chest, and felt a peace he had not known in years. The ghosts of war still lingered, but here, in this place once mocked as a junkyard, he had built something new. Not just survival, but a home. The light of the setting sun stretched across the land, painting it in gold. For Ethan, Emma, and Ranger, it was the beginning of a life hard won, a freedom forged not by power or wealth, but by truth, loyalty, and love. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant fields, but right here at home, in the quiet struggle to protect what we love. Ethan's story reminds us that no matter how broken the house, no matter how heavy the burden, courage, loyalty, and faith can turn even the darkest places into light. In our own daily lives, We may not be fighting in courtrooms or uncovering hidden legacies, but we all face challenges that test our strength. When we stand firm for truth, for family, and for hope, we honor those battles just the same. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, resilience, and love. May God bless you and your family. If you believe in the power of courage and loyalty, write Amen in the comments as a prayer for protection and strength.